Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Scott Horton. Scott is an American radio host and author. He serves as the editorial director of the Libertarian Institute and hosts the Scott Horton Show, where he has conducted interviews with experts on foreign policy, war, and civil liberties. His most recent book is called Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. He has also written several books on West Asia. Scott, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I've been reading your work, following you for a very long time, and a great admirer of your work. But I think before we get into the weeds of US foreign policy, I think an interesting point to begin with might be to ask you about your philosophical foundation behind the work on US foreign policy that you do. And it's interesting, perhaps, because sometimes even if our conclusions resemble, our foundations might be quite different. We, as leftists, might ask questions like, how does militarism serve capitalism through military industrial complexes, stimulus or rent seeking, or how is the power distribution within the international spheres or the system, and how does US or imperial intervention tilt the needle? I mean, these are questions we often think about. To my mind, it seems that your foundation is some combination of America first and the principle of non-intervention within libertarianism. So, how would you see the philosophical roots of the work you do, particularly your
Yeah.
anti-war work? Yes.
Well, look, I mean, even just on the economics, as you say, the military industrial complex and all the cronyism and rent seeking, to a libertarian, that's all the opposite of capitalism. That's not an expression of capitalism. Marx is wrong when well, in our view, it should never be allowed to be the case that big companies get to hijack the state and use it to socialize their costs onto the population while privatizing their profits, or even at all in the first place, and especially not use the national government to coerce foreign governments into serving their interests, whether that's opening markets to their exports or allowing American corporations in to use cheaper labor or whatever. If that's a foreign country's policy to keep us out, then that's up to them. And if American corporations can do business in other countries, fine. If they can't, should never be the role of the national government to go bullying other national governments into cooperating with American companies. And so, you know, the heart of libertarianism is anti-imperialism, because we don't want a domestic empire powerful enough to boss us around here. If we have a government powerful enough to dictate to you in New Delhi, then it's powerful enough to essentially lord over us in an authoritarian state. And as we've seen, we have an authoritarian state essentially in the United States now as the direct result of the adoption of the American empire and the national security state after World War II, and the growth of this military industrial complex and all of its attended corruption. So if you look, for example, at the great libertarian economist David Stockman, he has a book called The Great Deformation. And for him, what he's talking about is one big, giant, artificially government created bubble of American militarism. And so there's this entire conception of what the American economy would be, but then what it is instead because of militarism and imperialism. And that then has resulted in this great deformation of American power and the centralization of authority in Washington, D.C., and the corruption of capitalism in the country. And, you know, quite frankly, I think socialism is the greatest threat to America over the long term, because already government is this fiction by which everybody lives at the expense of everyone else. With avowed socialist controls, we're just all going to live in desperate poverty. And yet the more corrupt our capitalism is, especially because of militarism and because of the inflationary monetary system that's required to sustain militarism, more and more people, especially the young, turn towards socialism. Because just as you introduced the question, this is capitalism. So I'm the opposite of that, man. If that's what this is. Whereas, see, to me, this is why I'm a libertarian, because to me, real free markets are the opposite of this rather than socialism. But I can understand why so many people choose socialism, which is essentially just meaning government total control over the economy, when commissars sitting in a committee room have far less idea what prices should be than open markets operating. And so, if we want to have freedom and peace and prosperity, we need free market capitalism. And the more militarism and the more cronyism is, involved, the less credible that sounds to people, and the more they choose worse solutions. I'll give you another example, which I'm sure you could probably relate with this argument better, at least, that you have more and more people turning to right-wing economic nationalism and protectionism um, in the same kind of a way. And it's not really because of the failure of free trade. It's because of the failure of all of the waste of militarism, tens of trillions of dollars destroyed, and our monetary system, our inflationary monetary system, which causes this terrible boom bust cycle every 10 or so years, which throws people out of work and leads to these horrible recessions. And so people are so dissatisfied about the state of the economy and price inflation on their shelves and everything, that then they're willing to move further to the left and further to the right against principled free market economics, and turn more to government to save them from the consequences that the government of the problems that the government caused in the first place.
Yeah, I think just two quick response before I move on to the next question. I think we agree on our analysis about corruption of capitalism as it exists, but I think we on the left rely on the analysis of capitalism as it exists in historically. So if you talk about an idealism that never existed, that's not what generally the left talks about. So
Well,
the
well, look at the reality of
uh,
communism and people starving to death by the tens of millions. And the reality is this: in American capitalism right now, there are millions of firms that have nothing to do with the military industrial complex whatsoever, that don't exist off of inflationary money, that don't exist off of corruption. There
yeah,
are
but
some that do. And so it the reality of the success of the system of market capitalism and market prices is indisputable. The
yeah, but
problem
that's
is
that
really
I
the
was
Congress. The problem is the Congress that has the power to appropriate money taken from us coercively through taxation, and or the value of our money destroyed through inflation, and then the government then appropriating that money to their friends and their cronies. You can call that capitalism, and you'd be right in the sense of, if the ism means the system of state power, that and the most powerful cronies get to dip into the tax well, then that much is true. But if capitalism simply means a system of private property and voluntary exchange, then that's not inherent in the system. That's inherent in capitalism. That's inherent in the state itself, which has a monopoly on coercive force, gives itself the right to tax people and the right to appropriate that tax money to their friends.
Yeah, no, that free interaction of private actors, I think it's misleading to define that itself as capitalism, because if that's the definition of capitalism, then we push capitalism thousands of years before, because there are very solid works of history that markets have existed throughout human history. Since ages, and that's what I think socialists today would be one of the first set of people to acknowledge, that even when we are talking about market socialism, we are not talking about a socialism of, let's say, the Maoist period or the Soviet Union period where there were no markets. In fact, some of the best examples of socialism available today would be China, where it is taken for granted that markets are very integral to the part of the whole apparatus. And when you think about that top layer where the whole predatory activities of ransacking, of intransparency, and what Brodel actually called as that sphere of anti-capitalism. So depending on how one looks at it. So I think you would be more in a Brodelian sphere where you think that that is an anti-capitalist activity because that is intransparent, that's not an information that is transparent, and that's where power cobble together and come together. The leftists would say that that has always been part of what has made capitalism. So I think that's where we differ on our analysis, whether that the and I think
And how things work in Beijing. They
uh,
not have a
much better
ruling
than.
elite in that exact same way
I mean, it's
in their one party state.
it has a tremendously effective public system. So its infrastructure is not broken like many of the Western societies. Its ease of doing business is very good, actually. And that's why companies flock in it. I was reading the other day about a case why in the 1980s, American corporations were, this is even before the 1990s, before actually whole opening up happened in a much more dramatic way. They were ready to give up 50% of their private profit to the Chinese state, because even after giving up 50% of the private profit, they were earning much more. I mean, part of that you could argue that is because of the lower wages that they were extracting, but part of that was also because of what the state gives them. So overall, you see, in terms of technology, in terms of building human capital, in terms of giving social securities, Beijing is doing much more better than any comparable. I mean, if I think the comparison is way better if you compare it to New Delhi. You can also compare it to Washington, but I think the difference there is that these two societies are at different levels of development. So there are certain things which are very different. So China still has about 20% of people working in its land, which is not the case for the United States. So there are differences in those cases. But I think if you are arguing it today's socialist, I don't think the market argument is very fair, because what we are talking about is not commodity market, the sort of free voluntary interactions of, the spontaneity and so on. I think socialists today agree. I mean, I was born after 1990s, and I've always been raised with the belief that markets exist, and markets are one of the means of distributing resources. It's not always efficient. I mean, I can show you multiple graphs about prices, about financial assets that build up bubbles, but it is indeed efficient in many cases. So we have smartphones whose prices are going down and down, and that exactly fits to what libertarian arguments about capitalism is. But we also have enormous monopoly of rents, because the central bank has to keep them floating to actually keep capitalism from not having a deflation. And Hyman Minsky wrote about this, and we can go on and on about it. But I would give you the last response on this segment, because that was not.
Deflation is great.
I was talking
Deflation
about
is wonderful.
I was talking about debt deflation, which is a inflation of credit. So more and more credit that comes with price deflation. That means a collapse.
Yeah,
That's the
that's
great
socialism.
that's the great
That's
that's the
socialism
great
for the rich.
that's the Great
Yeah.
Depression moment, though. But I want to come back to what I wanted to discuss with you, and we can have this discussion if you like, or you can suggest people who would be willing to have this discussion on us. But this episode, I was planning to discuss more on U.S. foreign policy. I think before that, if you could tell us a little bit about what your thoughts on MAGA is, and how does Make America Great Again relate to libertarianism, because in many ways I think they have commonalities, but they would be very different on things like tariffs, things like very hard rigid borders, on maybe even immigration. I don't know what, but I mean, true libertarianism would be like in favor of immigration. How do you look at the MAGA movement, and what is your relationship with that as a libertarian?
Well, look, I think the MAGA movement, first of all, just represents a total rejection of the establishment consensus in the post-Cold War era. We've essentially had a one-party state: the Bushes, the Clintons, Biden and McCain, and these people who are all of essentially one mind on all of these horrific policies have really just destroyed everything. The problem is, of course, that In my point of view, it isn't free markets that have failed. There has been, to some degree, like, okay, yes, as we talked about, labor's cheaper in China. So there are some incentives, and in Mexico, there are some incentives for American corporations to leave the United States and leave people behind jobless, and move overseas. But the thing is, the government has made that essentially, um, has subsidized that, promises insurance, has like government agencies that'll help corporations move overseas and do all these things. And then, of course, have massive regulations that on the margin just make it make more sense to go somewhere else, even far away on the other side of the ocean, with all the shipping costs involved and security involved, just because the margins here are too damn tight, forced by our government. And then, as we're talking about, and this is something that right wingers more and more do understand, but have been kind of deceived about in the past, was that was the expense of the wars. That, when W. Bush launched the war in 2003, that year and in 2004, both, for anyone who paid income tax, they got a $300 or a $400 bonus check that essentially it seemed like it was a dividend. Like we were all making money off the war in Iraq. When, of course, no, we were taking $10 trillion and dumping it into the ocean, right? Completely destroying it. And yet it seemed to people like this is for us. People say war is good for the economy. That's why we got to do it all the time. War is good for the economy. Our standard of living depends on it. Right? None of that's true, right? All of this was at our expense in the American empire. Everything goes out and nothing comes back. I mean, yeah, they stole some gold bricks from Saddam, but like we're talking tens of billions of dollars. That's nothing, right? The cost is trillions of dollars at the expense of the American people. So then our economy, and here's the part where, speaking of Hyman Minsky, which I'm a friend of his son, we go back, and I know what he forgets is where all the money's coming from in the first place, and that is the Federal Reserve prints it and gives license to banks to print it, and that's where all those excess reserves come from that people then speculate on and build up the bubbles. So he's right. It's just he forgot the first part of the chain, which is government monopoly commissars controlling the currency. And they can only tax so much or will revolt. And they can only borrow so much or central banks will stop borrowing, right, and stop investing in their securities. And so then they print the rest. And now for regular Americans who don't understand why prices rise, they end up blaming the shopkeeper for raising prices, but they know that they can't afford to feed their families. They know that the price of groceries on the shelf have doubled, and you can't lie to somebody about that. I'm like, what do you mean a grocery bill is $600? It's supposed to be $300 to feed, whatever size family you're talking about. The prices of housing. You talk about deflation being bad. Tell me how it makes sense. And I don't know how it is in your country, but here, the price of a house keeps going up and up and up and up forever. When, of course, as we're all more productive, the price of a house ought to be getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as our standard of living does nothing but improve and increase based on all this productivity. But instead, what happens? The government keeps printing money, devaluing the currency. Now, that can seem like a big windfall if you already own a house and the value of your house goes up by $100,000. Now you can refinance it at a lower rate and get a bunch of cash out like it's a cash machine and get new countertops and everything. As Barack Obama might say, you didn't build that. That's essentially welfare for people who have already made it by artificially increasing the price of their house. Meanwhile, poor people and young people can't get into a house. They can't buy one. And a lot of times they can't even afford the rent. And in the Biden years, rents went up in Austin, Texas, where I'm from, rents went up from $1,000 to $1,500 to $2,000 to $2,500. Now, if you work at just a regular salary job, you're screwed. You're now a roommate in your 40s, moving back in with parents, living under a bridge, doing drugs to stay up all night so you don't get, beaten and mugged and lives destroyed. And it's all because of the inflationary money that is necessary to maintain the empire. And then what happens is people move further to the left and further to the right. They go, this is capitalism. If this is free market libertarian capitalism, I must be a socialist. Or if this is free market libertarian capitalism, I must be an economic nationalist. And I want Donald Trump to raise up tariffs, force those companies to come back from China, come back from Mexico, and give my cousin a job again, save my old town, and whatever that they imagine is going to happen from government intervention. But of course, tariffs are just massive taxes on the American people. And they could end up changing some trading patterns, but I don't think that any serious economist really predicts that it's going to lead to a massive return of manufacturing to the United States or manufacturing jobs. Maybe manufacturing come back here, but then it's going to be all robots doing most of the work anyway, just because times change. And so I think all of it really is folly. You see America putting tariffs on countries on goods that we don't produce, right? And things like just it's bad economics, and I don't trust any central planners, not in the Soviet Union or China or Washington D.C., to decide what prices should be and what trade flows should be. It should be purely between the people of the United States, private actors in the United States, and private actors in whatever country they're trading with to make their own contracts.
Yeah, I guess there are very few central planners that does price setting these days, unless in a very global South countries, there are essential commodities whose supply
Of
is
course
very
they
short.
do.
Where
What do you think a tariff is? You think that's not setting prices?
tariff is a tax, basically. It's a tax
Yeah.
on import and export on your national boundaries, and one of the reasons why the government is doing is that it needs more revenue for it. But a quick comment on, I
Okay,
agree.
this isn't setting a price. If Trump says I'm putting a 500% tariff on Chinese electric cars, that's not setting a price and
Yeah, no,
pegging that price higher than
that
American electric cars to protect them.
no, that definitely. I mean, the
That's central planning. That's
taxes do,
exactly what that is.
taxes do impact prices, but prices is a sum total of taxes and other factors of production, including
Oh,
labor,
thank
but
you so
also how
much
much
for the
is the markups.
clarification. Yeah.
Yeah, how much is the
Okay.
markup? But one quick comment on the money thing, I think, because you got it wrong. I mean, money has two components. One is the fiat money, which is what the central banks print, but um, with every 1 unit of fiat money produced, there are hundreds of units of private monies being generated. You know what happened in the
I said that.
1990s? I
I
mean,
already said that they give
but the
license
banks,
to private banks to print
of
money
course.
too.
So those are the private corporations that tremendously pumped money, which went into the. I mean, it initially begins with the repo market, and but eventually it went into the housing market. And the reason why in the 1990s asset price inflation happened so much was because beginning with 1994, when the Interstate Banking and Branching Act was created, banks were able to get bigger, and so now they could print more money. And then eventually in 1999, the repeal of the Glass-Steagall, which meant the commercial bank, the investment banks, and the insurance companies could come together, and they could invent all types of financial instruments to make even more money. And finally, in 2000, the derivative market was left unregulated, which meant even more money. And so effectively,
So how
what
does
I'm
that contradict anything that I said?
the main point of contradiction is that for capitalism to operate, you need money. You cannot have an expanding economy with constant money, or let alone like shrinking money. So for the economy to
According to
expand, which
you.
is the for the economy to expand, which is the main goal of capitalism, or else it's collapse under the weight of depression and deflation. It has to constantly keep expanding. So every time a bank or any private player give me a IOU, let's say a bank gives me a credit card of 10,000 limit, I can just go and spend 10,000. So $10,000 is just created. I mean, it's a private money, and everyone knows it. It has existed for decades.
Yeah, that's what I
This,
said. And that's what I'm
yeah, and
against.
I don't disagree with a lot of things you
You say
said,
it
but I
has to
think
be that way. I say it doesn't.
yeah, so that's I think is the main line of disagreement. All right, I want to switch to foreign policy, where I think which I thought would be what we would be discussing. So in the rest of the time, I wanted to begin by asking you, given you have written both on Eurasia and West Asia. And given both the places are have caught our attention in the last 3 years or so, I wanted to ask you that in that unipolar moment when it began, like in let's say 1991, with sort of defeat of Saddam Hussein in Iraq and the fall of Soviet Union in December 1991, did the American planners look at the two regions as one as part of a one grand strategy of uh, dominating the entire globe, or did they respond to these two places as two different pieces? That's something I would be interested to hear your thoughts from.
Yes, American dominance in the Middle East is always mostly predicated on the continuing Cold War with Russia and China. And at the end of the old Cold War, they still kept it on. And basically, it comes down to wanting to be able to maintain dominance, especially in Saudi Arabia, so that if we need to, we can have them ramp up production and crash the price of oil in order to bankrupt competitors, particularly the Russians. And Ronald Reagan did this to great effect to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And that's mostly unsaid, but a major part of the facet of the victory in the Cold War was bogging them down in Afghanistan, but also drop of the price of oil in a conspiracy with the Saudis. Essentially, trust me, we'll pay you back later, or we'll make it worth your while in airplanes or whatever. But we want to use this economic lever against the USSR, and which was very effective. Now the Chinese, they hardly have any oil at all. They're completely dependent on imports. And so control over the Middle East and the gates of Hormuz means strategic control over Chinese access to energy resources. And for that matter, Japan and Korea. You're our friends now. Well, you better stay our friends, because we can cut your ass right off. Because we control not just the sea lanes, but we control essentially the nation states, if not Iran, certainly the entire western shore of the Persian Gulf is under American sway there. And so it's not about Exxon, right? And just like with the pipeline wars against Russia in the Caspian Basin, the oil companies were like, hey, let's build a pipeline through Iran. And it was the Pentagon that said, no, 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 we're going through from Azerbaijan through Georgia and Turkey to the Mediterranean, not Iran. And that was, well, it was first of all the Israelis, and second of all, the Pentagon, who said, no, this strategy is all about screwing the Russians. It's not about making money for Houston. And they get to go along. But then when they go, well, look, if you want us to build a pipeline, an extra 200 miles, you're going to have to pay us an extra $10 billion to do it. So it was really all Washington, D.C. led policy rather than what you might think.
I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are on these so-called ceasefire talks that are going on in Washington and Tel Aviv. Netanyahu is in the town, and you must have seen that video when Trump was asked about the statehood of Palestine. He said he deferred it to Netanyahu, saying, I would defer it to Netanyahu, the best person to talk about Palestinian statehood. And they are talking about a ceasefire, returning of hostages with Hamas, without talking about, basically Palestinian statehood and withdrawal of Israeli military, particularly from Rafah, but also other parts of Gaza, settlement areas in West Bank, which is not part of this negotiation, but I'm adding on that issue. So they're not discussing the more substantive issue. What your thoughts are regarding these ceasefire talks? Would that lead to anywhere?
No, I don't think the Palestinian side is going to give in to the demands the way the Israelis are structuring it. And I think that the Israelis are probably really trying to make it an offer, that they can't possibly accept so that they can continue the war. The defense minister is talking about, yeah, what we're going to do is we're going to build a camp in the south to concentrate all the Palestinians in that area. I mean, that is obviously a deliberate provocation to even say it like that, that this is what they want to do. And so Hamas has said they won't sign anything short of a total ceasefire, end of the conflict rather than any kind of temporary thing now. And I can't imagine they're going to settle for, we're going to turn over all our people to an Israeli run concentration camp in what used to be the city of Rafah that they've wiped off the face of the earth now. I don't think they're going to give into that. And I would note that they asked Donald Trump also, well, is the war with Iran over? And he goes, well, you'd have to ask the prime minister that too. He's just completely bribed, bought, and paid for by Miriam Adelson's money, and is willing, as we saw in his first term, he's willing to recognize Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights, move the embassy to Jerusalem, which precludes the idea that the eastern half of the city could ever be the capital of a Palestinian state, and recognizes it as the entire city as the unified, eternal Israeli capital, as they claim. And then the Abraham Accords, where he prints as much money as he needs to in order to bribe Bahrain, Qatar, Sudan, and Morocco so far to make their normalization deals with the Israelis at the expense of the Palestinians, who they had always promised that they would not normalize relations until the Palestinians got a deal. And they're talking about, essentially, it's so funny the way they keep talking about it in the most explicit terms. I saw a clip of a Knesset member yesterday going, there are no innocents. They are all guilty. They're all terrorists. We should punish them. We should destroy them. We should make them suffer and then encourage them to voluntarily immigrate. Like, really? Yeah, I guess that's what Hitler called it too. Voluntary immigration. Get on the boxcar or I'll shoot you in the head. See, it's voluntary. He stepped right up and got right into that train, This is the mentality of the Israeli, Zionist right now, the Likud party, and I guess political consensus in Israel. In fact, they did a poll recently where they had super majorities of Israelis who said that they're perfectly fine with killing every man, woman, and child.
This is what Netanyahu also repeated in that press briefing. If that was press briefing, it was a dinner come press. But he said that the Palestinians should have the right to live in other parts of the region. I mean, that's basically his project of ethnic cleansing. On Iran,
I'm here to tell you, Donald Trump's going to help him do it. And I wouldn't be surprised if they're done carpet bombing, Ramallah and Hebron and Jenin, and if they need to, Bethlehem, in order to drive the Palestinians out of the West Bank. They don't give a damn, and Donald Trump will give them total license. He will have to be made to stop Netanyahu. Otherwise, he's going to let Netanyahu run completely wild and do whatever he wants.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the West Bank, because there are now very clear reports about how the atrocities in the West Bank, which has been ongoing for a long time, but has dramatically escalated since October 7. I mean, reports after reports saying how the attitude of the IDF, which now to many Palestinians looking back, appeared to them that it was much more benevolent before October 7. I mean, there was at least a facade of mechanism in which they could appeal to the IDF when settlers came in and stole their land and cattle and displaced them. But there is now no mechanism. I mean, the IDF would come and just displace them. And these are reports run by FT and all the mainstream press. I wanted to ask a question on Iran vis-a-vis Washington. There is a view within, let's say, what is sometimes called as the hardliner within Iran, or sometimes also called as the IRGC view, which is that Americans are hand in glove in all this. They need the oil and Iran's natural gas, or they would never be our. They would never want peace in the region, and there is no peace with the Americans, so we'd have to stay strong. And then there is the more sort of, for a lack of a better word, would be the moderate view, which would think that if we can negotiate with the Americans, and if Netanyahu can be somehow restricted, the Americans can be brought to a table, and the end result of that would be ultimately moving away the sanctions, which was the spirit of the JCPOA. Who is correct? I mean, as an American, if you're looking at it, and as a scholar who has looked at Washington,
well, they're both right. Yeah, no, they're both right. We can never have peace because of Israel. If only Israel could be restrained, then yeah, everything would be fine. We could have normalized relations with Iran a long time ago. You know, in 1979, in the revolution, the national security advisor was the famous Democratic foreign policy strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he had that egg all over his face, the hostage crisis and the failed rescue operation and everything else. But by 1993, when Clinton first came in, Brzezinski said, we can normalize relations with Iran. You know what we should do? We should build an oil pipeline across Iran, start making money and give us a mutual interest there. In fact, you may be familiar with this. As in 1997 and 1998, Dick Cheney repeatedly denounced Bill Clinton's sanctions against Iran, including the cardinal sin of going overseas and from Australia, giving a speech denouncing the sanctions and saying that, listen, God Almighty did not see fit to put all the oil under democratic nations. But what are you going to do? So we can do business with the Ayatollah. They're reasonable people over there. And then, of course, as we're talking about, once he's vice president, he can socialize all his costs, and the Marine Corps is free to him to do whatever he wants. He goes right into Iraq in order to try to establish dominance over Iran from next door, which didn't work. It was completely stupid, but that was free to him to go ahead and try it. Back when he was the head of Halliburton and he had to raise money from investors, he could do nothing of the kind. He said, we ought to be doing business with these guys and shaking hands with these guys. I mean, look what happened in the recent war. America bombed Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, and the Ayatollah fired 14 missiles back and then called ahead of time and said, listen, I'm firing 14 of my slowest missiles at you. Please be sure to shoot them all down. And I don't know exactly, but I think probably must have fired them at an empty part of the base, the same way he did back in 2020 after Trump killed Soleimani. And he sent essentially a symbolic strike in response to show that, look, I'm not a pacifist. I can't just do nothing. But what's he going to do? According to the Israelis, he can't wait to start a nuclear war to force the 12th Imam to come back. And he's willing to let Israel nuke every last man, woman, and child in Persia if he could only have the opportunity to bring on the end of the world. Meanwhile, he has a chance to shoot a couple rockets at an American base, and he does the absolute minimum that he can possibly get away with politically and still stay in power, essentially, because he wants nothing to do with a conflict with the United States of America that he would lose. All this religious mumbo jumbo notwithstanding, you know. And so, yeah, if it wasn't for the Israelis, you know, Yitzhak Rabin turned the policy of the periphery around and decided he wanted to demonize the Iranians back in 93. Well, so if the next Israeli leader just wanted to change Israeli strategy to, we want to be friends with the Persians again, then America could be friends with the Persians again. All this enmity begins and ends in Tel Aviv.
But that's least likely, given they have very few enemies who can stand up to them in the region at the moment. I mean, Syria is
Yeah.
gone, Egypt is gone, and with the Abraham Accord, I mean, even though they are not going ahead formally now at this moment when there is a genocide in Palestine, but the Arab leaders are basically saying yes
Yep.
to the Abraham Accord. I mean,
Yep.
one of the reasons, I mean, among many why Hamas carried out, I mean, there were many, but one of the reasons was also apparently was to sabotage the Abraham Accord,
Sure.
which Trump administration was pushing at
Yeah.
American
But you're
administration.
right. The Iranians are in a real position of weakness. Hezbollah has been severely crippled. They lost their leader and all their best fighters to either missile attacks or the pager attack. They lost their ally, Bashar al Assad, in Syria. They now got an Al Qaeda guy taking over the country there with Turkish, American, and Israeli help last December. Never mind 15 years ago and all the support that, Obama and the allies gave Al Qaeda in Syria from 2011 through 17 there. But and then the Houthis are only so useful to the Iranians anyway. They are never that close of allies. I mean, obviously they have a friendship, but there's a great article years ago called "The Houthis Are Not Hezbollah," which said that, like, yeah, look, Hezbollah is essentially Iran's 51st state over there in Lebanon, but the Houthis are not. The Houthis, the Zaidi Shia used to run Yemen for centuries. You know what I mean? Their power is not dependent on Persia. It never has been. And they're Zaydis and not Twelvers. So they're a whole different sect of Shiite Islam, and much closer to Sunnis and pray with them and everything, and shared mosques, and just have their own deep history in that country, and their own claim to power, which they essentially took power in alliance with the former dictator that America had betrayed and pushed out, and who decided he went away mad, Abdullah, and made an alliance with his old rivals, the Houthis, and took over the country back in 2015. And he tried to stab them in the back, and they got him first in 2017. But they've been in power since then. They shoot some rockets off and all that, but they don't make for much of a proxy. And Hezbollah was really Iran's strategic depth in the region. And I don't know like how you quantify it, but they clearly have been taken down a few pegs there, and were, for example, in no position whatsoever to help Assad in December. And so yeah, the Iranians are really on their back foot, I have to say. And I'm not hearing people really talk about this that much, although maybe I'm behind on some reading, but it very much remains to be seen what the ultimate Iranian reaction to the air attack is going to be. I don't know. I still don't know the exact extent, and I don't know if anybody really knows the exact extent of the damage at Fordo and Natanz, but clearly they know how to make aluminum tubes and turn them into centrifuges and spin uranium hexafluoride gas if they can rebuild a conversion facility, which we destroyed their conversion facility at Isfahan. But if they can dig a deeper series of tunnels under a taller mountain and get started again, there was at least one report where they were claiming we've already started building a new secret nuclear facility that you won't be able to touch this time. So, and in the president of Iran's interview with Tucker Carlson, he said, we're not stopping enrichment whatsoever. We're not stopping our nuclear program. We're still going on. And I forget. I'm sorry. I don't want to overstate that. I think the implication, I'm not sure if Tucker Carlson asked him that explicitly, but the implication was, yes, we're going to continue our nuclear program. No, we still are not going to make atom bombs, but we are going to continue our nuclear program, and you can't stop us, which is really kind of interesting because, I've always argued that what they have is a civilian program, but it's a latent nuclear deterrent. The threat is, don't call our bluff. We won't make atom bombs, but if you bomb us, then we might. So don't, right? And now their president explicitly disavowed ambitions toward nuclear weapons. Now that could have been a damn lie, and they may have embarked on a secret program, 3 days before that. I don't know. But he at least claimed that their policy has not changed. Well, if just that is the case, then forget if they're really breaking out toward a nuclear weapon. If they still are just going to continue their same civilian nuclear program, Donald Trump's already proven that he's willing to consider that a nuclear weapons program, and he's willing to bomb them again. He's willing to go to war over it. Certainly if Israel starts it and drags us in, but then ultimately he did send in the U.S. Air Force to drop those bunker busters. And so we very well could be on a path to, a continued long-term conflict with Iran, where this is, the so-called 12-day war is just the first stage in what is still remains an unresolved problem, which I must stipulate, again, from the point of view of Tel Aviv and Washington, not any reasonable person, I don't think, when clearly they were not making nuclear weapons. And the only reason that they were enriching up to 60% is so that they had a bargaining chip to negotiate away, trying to pressure America to get back in the deal that we already had, and which wasn't perfect, but it was perfectly good enough to use as the basis for further negotiations and the further warming of relations between the United States and Iran. And Trump was right that, man, there are a lot of sunset provisions in this thing that go away in 5 or 10 years, which is a blink of an eye. Here we are. Some of these sunsets would already be lifted by now. But the thing is, when Trump came in 2017, he could have said to the Ayatollah, now listen, I don't like the previous guy, and I don't like this deal, but we do have a deal. I just got here, so let's see if we can make it better. And he could have negotiated in good faith. He could have lifted some of the sanctions and said, okay, I'm testing you, Ayatollah. I'm going to go ahead and lift some of these sanctions like in the promise, but I want you to come back to the table and discuss some of these 5 and 10-year sunsets. I don't like them, whatever. If he had attempted to approach it that way, well, what the hell? We'd at least be living in a world where we see what that looks like. And I think it's very likely that he could have gotten the Ayatollah to change the deal, essentially to alter the deal, to remove some of those sunsets and other things, because frankly, just Trump drives a much harder bargain than Barack Obama and John Kerry ever could. But the Ayatollah has shown that he's willing to cooperate with this. He really does not want a conflict. And as crazy and radical as they say he is, which, by the way, you notice that's what they say about David Koresh. It's what they say about Saddam Hussein. It's what they say about Muammar Gaddafi and Bashar al-Assad. They're crazy, which is what? It's just right. And same thing for Hamas. They write themselves a license that they don't have to negotiate with this guy, because you could never believe anything he could say anyway, which is just a lie, right? Like, even when you're talking about the Kims in North Korea or whatever, they want to live. And it doesn't mean you can trust them. But the point is, you can negotiate with them, and including inspection regimes and verification measures and things to make sure. Right. I like to quote Ronald Reagan said about Soviet disarmament, that, well, trust but verify. Well, what does that mean? It means distrust. It means no trust at all. Trust has nothing to do with it other than being polite and pretending, oh, I trust you, but I'm sending my guys to look at what you're doing. Right. That's the verify part. So we could absolutely just have, and I'm just purely convinced of this. Donald Trump could get on a plane and go to Tehran tomorrow. He could go to Moscow, go to Beijing, go to Pyongyang, and be Trump the Great. We don't have to have a conflict. We don't have to pivot from Middle East terror wars to great power conflict. We just not have power conflict at all. And Donald Trump said this himself when he came into power. He goes, I don't want to pivot to Russia and China. I want to pivot to peace and prosperity and get along with everybody. Now, I don't know, maybe somebody giving him some muscle relaxers, or someone cracked the whip and reminded him, who he really serves up there. But that was what he said when he was musing out loud. Like, geez, I don't know. And look at it. Pretend you're the president of the United States for a minute. You kind of have everything to give and nothing to lose, right? The most powerful world empire sitting on a giant stockpile of H-bombs and a giant navy and 2 giant oceans and 2 weak and friendly neighbors. And like, I don't know, man. What are you in such a bad mood for? Can't you just figure out a way to get by? We're friends with every power in Europe. There are no powers in Latin America or Africa. Forget that. There's India, but India is kind of a middle rank power. And do we have a lot to compete with India about? Do we have a lot is there really anything for us to get into conflict with India about? Mostly right now, our empire wants to help use you to hedge against China. But I think we could just not do any of this. And I think China and India, you guys have your own history and can work out your own problems. And you'd probably do a better job of it without American interference in the middle.
Well, thanks for saying that. That's one of the that was one of the sticking points in my interview with Professor Mearsheimer, where we got into a big debate. I mean, his position was that the United States is necessary in not just East Asia but also South Asia to sort of manage and diffuse these smaller conflicts that exist. And our position was that, well, these are border conflicts that remain when empires break down, and it takes some time because these are new nation states. But the presence of the United States convert these border problems into larger strategic problems, which becomes explosive, and it builds up arms race and so on and so forth.
And quite frankly, it's my same argument against central planning. When John Mearsheimer says the U.S. should manage these relationships, he's talking about a committee room full of idiots who don't know anything and who couldn't possibly make the right decision how to manage these things. They talk about, what we're doing? We're building a giant nuclear sub base in Australia. We want to station a bunch of nuclear subs. We expect the base to be ready by the end of the 2050s. So that's our strategy. That's our plan. Cold War, threatening hot war, potential conflict with China from now on through the end of the century. Nobody has a better strategy than that for how we're supposed to move forward other than Cold War. It's just nuts. And like all other things being equal, right? John Mearsheimer is a realist school guy. He's not a libertarian. All other things being equal, you say, okay, fine. How about we like have some naval capacity in the Pacific as a contingency while we try to figure out a grand treaty so that we can just get along and not fight? Why not have a mutual understanding with the rising power, China, in and recognize their sphere of influence to a degree, to a compromisable degree in the region, and try to prevent conflict from breaking out in the first place? Seems to me like ganging up on China and making sure to have all these memorandums and all these military bases in Korea and Japan and Australia, and I don't guess we have bases in India, but working more and more on interoperability and using India as an auxiliary for American naval power and the rest in the region. It seems like all that is more likely to make the Chinese race to build an even bigger navy and to, just, which again, men are responsible for their own behavior. I'm not saying everything every person ever does in the world is purely a reaction to the United States. And yet I am saying that, boy, a lot of things that people do are direct reactions to the United States. And in fact, oftentimes direct reactions to things that we clearly should not be doing in the first place, that clearly are risky and clearly are even thought of by men who are going to be out of power in 3 years and don't care, instead of thinking, about the long-term health of our relationships, especially with the major powers. I mean, for example, my book Provoked, I show you 30 years worth of the people in charge saying, boy, we better not do this or we're going to get in a conflict with the Russians. And then they do it anyway. And they do it over and over and over again. They say, we don't want to move the dividing lines in Europe. We want to erase them. Boy, if we just move the dividing line further east, well, that's just going to lead to a conflict with the Russians within the next 20 years. And then on schedule, the conflict breaks out 20 years after the guy said that, or what, you know what I mean? It's the most obvious thing in the world. They all know what they're doing. It's the self-fulfilling prophecy and the slow motion train wreck at the same time. It happens over and over again.
Yeah, probably the Noam Chomsky one once called the mafia principle in international relations. I mean, one of the reasons negotiations don't work is because superpowers don't believe in them. They like the more mafia principle. And of course, they don't trust others because they are not trustworthy. I mean, if anyone reads
Right.
your book, Provoked, one would know that if there are anyone who are not to be trusted are the American planners and elites. And they know that because they are part of that.
Yep.
And so I want to be respectful of your time, but if I could end this by asking you a little bit on Ukraine and Russia. We went a little bit
Sure.
too long in the initial rounds. I think the one question I would like to ask you at this point about Ukraine and Russia is, given this is a conflict about NATO primarily, what does these 3 years, im- what has it clarified about the fate of NATO that began, let's say, in this region in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union? Has the Russian offensive, and now, of course, Russia is pushing more and more to the west with every day. I mean, yes, they are taking some losses, but they are constantly pushing west. Has the offensive convinced NATO planners and leaders that this is the limit of NATO in Eurasia and we must accept that? Or has it actually given them a justification for their presence, which has always been debated since 1991, as your book has shown, that what is the region of existence of NATO now that the Soviet Union is gone? So has this new offensive actually given them a justification and they are probably salivating because now they can justify their own position? Or has it caused a rethinking that, well, maybe this is the limit and we should pull back? What's your intuition?
Well, certainly Donald Trump has said this is the limit and has said, not that he's, shown a willingness to sign this, or, well, actually, I think that's not true. I take that back. I think he has said in his proposed peace deal that, look, I'll sign that we're not going to ever bring Ukraine into NATO. So that is a major shift. The American policy has been since 99 that there's an open door, which doesn't mean that we're in a hurry to bring Ukraine into NATO. when it means that nobody else can tell us we can't. And Trump is saying, nah, I do recognize that Russia can tell us we can't. This is a bridge too far, and I'm not taking it. And he has enshrined that as official policy now. As far as the rest of Washington, D.C., they can't wait till Donald Trump is gone so that they can try to put things back the way they were before. So overall, has the mood in Washington shifted with Donald Trump's electoral fortunes and change of doctrine there? I don't really think so. I think, if you polled the guys at the Council on Foreign Relations or whatever, I think they're probably pretty much right where they were a year ago. The question is, what stage is the war going to be in at the end of Trump's presidency? It's going to be almost certainly, well, this phase of it will almost certainly be over by then. Whether the Ukrainian military still exists at that time, I think is a major question. But Trump, unfortunately, is just not in a position to make peace here. And I think the war could continue for quite another while because, of course, even if the Ukrainian military breaks, they still could wage an insurgency from the Carpathian Mountains, and there are swamps in Volhynia and forests kind of, to the west of Kiev there, where you could base some insurgency out of there. And there's a massive tunnel network under Odessa as well, if the Russians are so bold as to try to take the city of Odessa, which, again, assuming the conclusion that they're going to break the Ukrainian military at some point and then have the run of the place, then they can still face a real insurgency for a long time. And America and Western powers could continue to back it. And I think they probably will. They think that that's smart, strategically weakening the Russians by keeping the war going. And it is an enormous expense for Russia. And, they are going to have to pay the piper eventually. Although I'm sure that they'll have decided it will have been worth it for gaining the territory that they've gained and all that, and leaving Ukraine a greatly weakened rump state. But now, so, the way you phrased the question was about NATO, not just the United States, right? So you have I think, Britain and France and Germany and Poland and all that, they are all reinforced in their beliefs that this is why we need NATO so badly. And that even, probably if the United States left NATO, which I think is probably not in the cards, but if the United States did leave NATO, I think the rest of the countries would want to stay in it or replace it with a similar security structure. And to their own detriment, right? Like the problem is you can't go back. There were so many alternatives to this policy. But now how do you fix it? And with the Russians are going to be closer to NATO than they were before. When America wasn't actually bringing Ukraine into NATO, just sort of, kind of, right? With the interoperability, making them sort of a de facto member of NATO. But now, Russia's got themselves on this slippery slope. Once they invaded, they took virtually everyone who favored Russia out of the country. And then now they're, in the name of protecting all the Russian speakers or whatever, looks like they're going to end up taking the entire eastern half of it. And now that leaves them with a Western country, Western Ukraine, west of the Dnieper River, that's completely dominated by far right-wing nationalists who absolutely hate them and are determined to join Europe and join NATO and be an anti-Russian bridgehead right there. So they've caused their own series of problems there. So now what do? Keep going and just cleanse all of the Ukrainian nationalists all the way out of the country into Moldova and Poland? Or, they've left themselves, they painted themselves into that corner, kind of. And now they're going to have, they used to win elections. The guys that they favored anyway, used to win elections. That's why America had to cheat and overthrow the regime there twice in 10 years, right? But now that's never going to be true again. So they've sort of set themselves on a path, I think, to eventually conquer the entire country, which they may or may not be able to do. They may or may not want it now, but I think they're going to find themselves, let's say it's 3 or 4 years from now, they're going to find themselves still fighting an insurgency based out of the West, and they're going to determine to put an end to it and keep going, right? So I'm really pessimistic about the Ukraine war. I blame Washington for starting it. I don't see any good solutions to end it now. And I think that we have no real threats to make. We send in more weapons and add more sanctions. We already tried that. And Trump can promise to normalize relations with Russia. But then if you're the Russian leadership, can you trust that when clearly the entire American political establishment absolutely hates them, hates anyone connected to Putin or his party or his government in any way? That like in a few years, the Democrats could be back and just undo everything. So Trump would have to make some, sign 10 awesome new treaties, on complete nuclear dismantlement and working together on who knows what XYZ, to try to mend that relationship to such a degree that the Democrats wouldn't be able to tear it back up again, which I think is just very doubtful, unfortunately. So I think the Ukrainians are screwed.
Yeah, if at all, the needle seems to be moving in the opposite direction now. I mean, Trump has said that a week ago there was some pause in some of these Patriot systems and other Hellfire missiles
That's
deliveries, but
canceled. Yep.
but that's canceled, and now he's saying that
Yep.
we'll send them, and he's calling them defense systems, but these are not really defense
Yep.
system. It includes F-16 and so on and so forth.
And
And
he said, Putin talks real nice, but it's all bullshit, which I think is right. That Putin says, "Oh, Donald Trump, you're so tall and handsome and successful. Yeah, I'll give you a ceasefire," and then doesn't. Right? I'll do this, I'll do that, but then he wants Trump to like him. He talks nice on the phone, but is he really willing to climb down? And
do
look
you
at the
think,
position that he's in now.
real quick, do you think that Putin at this moment is really um, pushing for more and more because he thinks that he'll be able to expand at what they are calling as buffer? Or do you think that it is Washington that doesn't understand something,
Well,
what Putin is asking for, that is forcing Putin to like keep pushing? Like, what's your
yeah.
intuition about that?
Well, so the thing is this is the Russians have claimed to have annexed these entire four oblasts, these provinces in the east, but they only control Luhansk. They control, I don't know, three-quarters of
Lots of
Donetsk, but
Donetsk. Yeah.
they only control about half of Zaporozhye and Kherson, and half of Kherson's on the other side of the river, or a significant third of it or something is on the other side of the river there. And they've officially annexed all these territories, but they're fighting a war of attrition where they're taking their slow ass time grinding up the Ukrainian military to where then eventually they'll take whatever land they want. Well, in their proposed treaty, they said Ukraine has to withdraw entirely from Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson and let us take them all. Well, the Ukrainians are going to do that, turn around and walk off territory that they're still standing on. They're not going to. And the Russians know that, but they're just not there yet. Right. And then I
Also
hope
shrink
I'm
its
wrong about all my
military.
slippery slope stuff here. But I think once they get there, they're going to look at Kharkiv and they're going to look at Dnipropetrovsk or whatever that the oblast between the river and the Donbass. They're going to look at Odessa and they're going to look at Transnistria, which is on the Moldovan side of the border. The Moldovan side of the river is this strip of land controlled by Russia, on the Ukrainian Moldovan border. And they're going to say, well, geez, why not take Odessa and then go all the way to Transnistria? And I think, especially once they've destroyed the Ukrainian army and have the run of the place, I I'd be, I guess, pleasantly surprised in a weird sense of that term if they just stop at the four provinces they've already decided to officially annex and not go ahead and take Kharkiv and Sumy and Dnipropetrovsk and Odessa and the entire southern coast at that point. And I know for a fact there are people in Russian politics and media who are loudly harping on that to this day. We've come this far. We're not going to stop now. That's our city. Catherine the Great founded Odessa, whatever. This is how they see it. So, um, it's a real shame because I think they probably can't afford to do it. I think they've got the men, they've got the money, and they've got the time. And America doesn't really have any cards to play to make them stop. And so, um, yeah, I think it's a real catastrophe for Ukraine. I don't know what's even going to be left of Ukraine by the time this thing is over in terms of their population and all that. They have millions of people flee the country, hundreds of thousands of people, high hundreds of thousands of people killed and wounded, and just they're and then total bankruptcy. This entire war effort's being paid for by the West. Once that runs out, they face total collapse, and losing. I mean, the majority of the population of the country and the majority of all their GDP came out of the far east of the country. That's where all the mining was. That's where all the factories and everything were. And even most of the good farmland is in, most of the east of the country. And so it's much more sparsely populated in the West and much less productive economically in the West. They don't have the minerals and all of the stuff that they do in the East. So what's left of Ukraine is going to be in a real crisis for a very long time. And you know, what's left in NATO wants something to do. They'll be plenty occupied, which is trying to contain the Ukrainian crisis in the aftermath of this.
On what's left on NATO, France President Macron said that we will fight it to the last minute. I mean, it's not the first time they are saying that,
Yeah,
just to reiterate. But I think the
sure.
context I'm asking is, and he said it because this is our security and our values. I mean, but the question I'm asking it because there is a question mark about the fate of NATO and the recent NATO summit, Donald Trump asking for European countries to spend 5% of their GDP, I mean, and which 32 countries have agreed on. And of course, there are commentators which are saying that they won't be able to commit to 5% of their GDP given their economies are in ventilators. But there are real, I mean, surplus economies within the European Union, Germany, for instance, and others, which can definitely bump up if they like. They have a lot of fiscal room. Then, if Europe takes a larger share within NATO, then the Ukrainians are gone even more because then there is no peace because it is the Europeans who are much more hell bent in keeping this conflict alive.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But look, I think, the French and the British and the Germans like to really talk tough when they know it takes America to back them up. They know that they don't have the logistics to supply. If America was out, never mind French troops on the ground, they don't even have the ability to supply the Ukrainian army with what they need to fight. It takes the United States, not just in the equipment itself, but in the logistics and the manpower and the everything else. Um, Europe can't fight this war for Ukraine. And you can see what a damn liar Macron is when he's not willing to send even the French Foreign Legion in there, much less their regular army, because he knows that would lead to nuclear war. Oh, I'm willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. How brave of you, you know? Um, and I think people are really starting to see through that. And I do fear the blowback from this. America and the West have really betrayed the Ukrainians. They promised them in no uncertain terms over and over and over again, whatever it takes for as long as it takes to help you win this war. We're going to drive the Russians to bankruptcy. We are going to force their military out. We're going to reclaim every square inch of Ukraine back to 1991 borders, including Crimea. And they said it over and over and over again. And the Ukrainians continued their war on the basis of those promises. When the Western side, Washington and the rest of these capitals, they knew all along that Ukraine was going to lose. It's been as plain as day. They knew it as good as those of us at antiwar.com. That at the end, Kamala Harris herself said, Russia is a bigger country. Yeah, it is. And it's right next door. And they're not going anywhere. Ukraine is. And that's why we used to call it the Ukraine. Because as far as Americans were concerned, it was part of Russia anyway. Most Americans didn't even know it was anything but a region of Russia. Oh, you say they declared independence in 91? Not that anyone in America noticed. What difference does it make to us? You know what I mean? You could say if you told us it was on the other side of the Ural Mountains, we'd be like, okay. Like, I'm trying to remember. On my Risk board, Ukraine was like this giant borderland to the west of Russia. When I played Risk when I was a kid, I remember when I saw the real Ukraine on a map, I was like, what the hell? Anyway, it's not, it's not of true importance to the Americans. And even the worst of the warhawks admit that from time to time. Like, actually, we don't really care who rules the northern coast of the Black Sea at all. What difference does that make to the United States of America? Nothing. As long as they don't close the Bosporus. So it's just the whole thing is the Ukrainians ultimately are going to be left that high and dry by the Americans who never actually cared about them in the first place. And then, how are they going to react to that? I don't know. Hopefully they don't hold hard feelings like the South Vietnamese. On the other hand, I think they might, since a lot of them are a bunch of Hitler-loving Nazis. At least some of their leaders. I don't know. Probably the most of those Hitler-loving Nazis are already dead, but they do have some of their leaders like Dmitry Yurash, who's right now the head of the Third Separate Infantry Division up there. Who did I say Dmitry Yurash? I'm sorry, I meant Andrew Beletsky, um, from the Azov Battalion. Um, People like him, and I'm not sure where Yurash is these days, but I think those type guys are going to end up in high levels of political leadership in the new Ukraine. And everybody loves a good stab in the back story, but Nazis especially love a good stab in the back story. We would have won if we hadn't have been betrayed by those that betrayed us. And, that can be a real powerful narrative for the decades going forward there about what could have been if only the Americans had not made a bunch of promises and then let us down. And we're going to have to deal with the repercussions of that. I hope the positive repercussions would be that other people around the world would just not believe in us anymore. Oh, you're going to make a bunch of big promises about all the things you're going to do for us, huh? And all the dangers you're going to protect us from, huh? Yeah, well, we saw what happened in Ukraine, pal. And I hope people around the world will take that lesson to heart, that no, actually, we're not coming for you. We'll get you into a fight, but we're not going to save you from one. And
Yeah.
so that would be the silver lining on the dark cloud of American betrayal here, would be if more and more the rest. Hell, I hope the Poles and the Lithuanians are paying attention too, the Hungarians and the Bulgarians.
The Taiwanese.
Yeah, the Taiwanese. You really believe that Uncle Sam is going to protect you? You should probably make other arrangements.
Yeah, Israel might be an exception, though. We'll leave it there, Scott. Thank you.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yes, thank you so much for your time and the open conversation. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Me too.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.